Recently, I made a video about the top 10 starters for Path of Exile 322 Trial of the Ancestors, and a lot of people said, yeah, but I've played all of these builds, or this is boring, can I have something different? So today, I'm going to talk about my picks for the top 3 off-meta starters. And this whole video is just my opinion. Plus, these are off-meta builds. They're not going to perform as well as the top picks. The tried and true are meta for a reason. So if you just want the best League Start build, or the best build possible, you should go with something from that list. However, if you've already played all of those, you want something different, and maybe you're looking to branch out or experiment, I'd say first of all, you should know that you're getting to something that's going to be a little more difficult. But as long as you're okay with that, here are 3 builds that I'd recommend, all of which look really cool, and one of which is so off meta that you can barely find any information on it if you look at Piri Ninja. Now, like with the previous video, I am going to be showing gameplay for all of his skills. This is not to be taken as reflective of League Start or exactly what your build will look like. It's just to give you a really rough idea of what the skill is, so that way you can see how it interacts with enemies, and also what the animation looks like. The gameplay is all on old characters that I kinda half threw together in Standard. Again, it is not reflective of the build in any way beyond, ooh, that's what that looks like. Now, I know I'm about 2 minutes deep in disclaimers, and I do apologize for that. However, I wanted to make expectations as clear as possible going into a video like this one. If off-meta builds aren't for you, I can absolutely recommend my top 10 starters, or if you're looking for my thoughts on builds that I've played personally, Poison Spark and Righteous Fire Juggernaut, even if it's not necessarily a League starter, get subscribed as those videos should be coming out in the near future. For now, let's get into option number 1, Frostblade's Trickster. And this got a lot of attention because Captain Lance recently played it, though he's not the only person to try the build. And I've had my eye on this for quite a while, because Trickster's a very interesting ascendancy, and one that feels really good to play in a similar way to Pathfinder. Unfortunately, in comparison to other builds on this list, the early campaign and your single target damage is going to be a little painful. You could either play a different skill and swap once you get to maps, or just push through the pain, because it'll be a little painful, but it looked very doable to me. The nice thing about Frostblades is it's a melee attack that spawns projectiles. These projectiles fan out and clear packs quite efficiently. You can add things like chain or fork if you want to make your clear better. Or alternatively, you can strike nearby additional targets. One of the reasons behind Frostblade's popularity was Vengeant Cascade, allowing things to double dip a little bit on single target, and unfortunately that's gone. I don't think it's quite worth using return projectile support, though I'm sure that people who are playing it in the new league will experiment, so stay tuned and watch Piri Ninja to see if it ends up getting used or not. Personally though, I'm leaning to no, because after I got a couple strikes, the clear seemed totally fine even without returning projectile support. And while the single target damage wasn't great, my gear was uber scuffed, and just half thrown together, so it doesn't really reflect the quality of the build. After looking around on Piri Ninja, I noticed there's several items being used by Frostblade Tricksters, so I wanted to go over those quickly. First up, Heat Shiver. This gives cold damage as extra fire damage provided you're able to chill or freeze an enemy. Since your damage is base fizz converted over to cold, Frostblades is quite good at freezing things. Just keep in mind that you need a minimum freeze duration, otherwise the freeze can get discarded. As far as I know, this hasn't been fixed, and that's why a lot of people use Southbound when they're early on in the gearing stage. The other big advantage of Heat Shiver is it enables Trinity for absolutely massive damage. If you want to get even more, consider Yoke of Suffering. Not only does this allow all of your damage, think fire and cold, to shock, like this build should easily be able to, then enemies take 5% increased damage per ailment on them. A few other commonly used uniques included Circle of Fear to enable Herald of Ice, Atziri's Step to cap suppression, or Legacy of Fury to scorch enemies and clear more easily. I think if you don't have additional strikes, Legacy of Fury is good, but given that a lot of RF players will be buying it, there should be a fair bit of demand and therefore competition for the item, in which case I'd probably just go with something else like Atziri's Step and use additional strikes to bolster the clear. The Trickster Ascendancy itself is very powerful and well suited for the job. First up, you've got Polymath, 3% more damage for each different type of mastery you have allocated. This encourages you to travel across the tree and get all the different masteries. It even gives you Energy Shield on kill, Life on kill, and Mana on kill, which makes you feel almost invincible while mapping. If you're not one-shot, you should explode enemies and almost immediately heal back up to full, plus recover your resources, which gives you a really good way to sustain your mana, especially early on when you don't have a good solution for that. Trickster also has Swift Killer for increased charge duration and maximum frenzy charges. Throw in a little Frenzy Gen, and you're going to have a party with the extra move speed, attack speed, and more damage multiplier. But the most important reason to play Trickster would be One Step Ahead in my opinion. As a note, it's called One Step Ahead, and yes, this is my opinion. Your action speed is at least 108% of base value. Think of this as Tailwind, except it can be modified. So if you stand in a puddle that would slow you, nope, you're at 108% with permanent Tailwind. Which, oh my god, this makes Path of Exile feel so much better because there are effects like Chill or the Delirium puddles that slow you down or maim, and all of those feel terrible. But preventing your action speed from being slowed is just great, and capping it at 108% makes everything feel super responsive. But it gets even better, because nearby enemy monsters' action speed is at most 92% of base value. You're sped up by 8%, and they're slowed down by 8%. Combine this with a little chill and freeze, and you should have no trouble avoiding bosses. And on that note, I wouldn't necessarily say that Frostblade Trickster is my first, second, or even third choice for bossing, but hey, at least you'll be able to dodge the attacks. The single target can just be a little bit weak early as you don't necessarily hit hard enough to reliably freeze them, thus you don't get to enable Heat Shiver. But for now, let's get into things and look at a little bit of gear based on a character someone actually played. Alright, so here I have a level 97 character from day 3 on PewieNinja. Again, I just want to be clear, this is not to call someone out or pick on someone. I'm going to be talking about things that I see and what I would do differently. This is to give you an idea of an actual build played by someone, and I'll take a look at PewieNinja after this to give you a slightly broader perspective on what other people are doing differently. So first up, on this build, I think the defenses are a little lower than I would like. They got to level 97, so clearly they're comfortable with them. But personally, I would want some Fizz taken as, and definitely cap my suppress by day 3. I think the easiest way to get, so there's no suppress on the shield currently. That would be a really easy way to cap out the suppress, and you can probably get a Fizz taken as prefix on your chest piece. That solves 2 of my biggest problems with this setup. We've got a Heat Shiver, that's going to give a lot of damage. You definitely will be freezing a lot of enemies. And we've also got a Yoke of Suffering, so a lot of enemies will be shocked. And as you can see, that's pretty good damage because it's the melee hit and the Icy Blades. In this case, I'm going to guess they aren't even using Vengeance Cascade. They're using Winter's Embrace, so you don't have to worry about the changes to that. We've got Adziri's Step providing a good bit of suppress, and Salia's Sign adding a surprising amount of damage at the cost of not having very many defenses associated with it. There's no life or res here. Then looking at the tree, let's play the Count the Mastery game. Because for Polymath, you want as many different masteries as possible, which really forces you to be clever and efficient. Mana Mastery, that's 1. Claw Mastery, that's 2, and really important if you're using Elusive. Mark Mastery, that's 3, and your Frenzy Charge gen, since you want to generate Frenzy Charges as a Trickster. Leech Mastery, that's 4. Instant Leech means that if a build isn't killed outright, it's going to recover incredibly quickly. Dagger Mastery is 5 and gives Elusive Effect, also more damage through Nightblade. Attack Mastery is 6, and you get an extra projectile which helps when clearing. Spell Suppression Mastery makes you a little bit tankier against spell damage. We're at 7. Crit takes you up to 8. Increased effective non-damaging ailments should help scale the shock and keep the freeze active. Accuracy is 9, get a little bit of extra accuracy. Life is 10. I forget if I counted the elemental. I think I didn't. 25% chance to invert, which interestingly is a massive amount of damage against highly resistant enemies. Last but not least, you've got the Reservation Mastery, which brings it up to 12 for 36% more damage from Polymath. Something else to note, the Heartstopper effect here, take 40% less damage. It's inconsistent, but it is highly effective when it's active. Then Swift Killer feels really good with Frenzy Charges, so those are up. The damage is getting pretty respectable. And in terms of damage, remember that 400k that didn't look very good? We're at 1.6 mil, except also, you've got Trinity up the entire time. I guarantee against any sort of frozen target, oh yeah, there's a huge overlap range there. So you've got that up, and this isn't even counting Elusive, I don't believe. Nope, there we go. It is up to 4 mil DPS, which when mapping is more than enough to clear very easily and consistently. Again, this is more towards the glass cannon side, so having this level of damage is quite good. Will all of that apply on bosses? I'm not sure. I don't actually know if the build's damage is at a point where it'll all apply on bosses. I'm not super familiar with freeze calculations. You'd have to look into one of the guides that I'll recommend towards the end of this segment for more information on that. But I do know just mapping, killing trash, this is going to feel really good. You're going to freeze a lot of stuff, and that's another defensive layer that often gets underrated. Because if you're not worried about going in and doing a ton of pinnacle bosses, you'll do your quest Eater, your quest Exarch, and then you'll say, I live in maps. Well, frozen enemies can't damage you, and you don't need defenses if you're freezing everything. Though, in regards to that, there is one extra defensive layer that personally I'd really want to run on a build like this, even if it means giving up Grace. In fact, especially if it means giving up Grace, I probably want to put in Determination instead. I'd want something like a Granite Flask instead. Maybe dropping the Stibnite. Yeah, definitely dropping the Stibnite. Something like that. So now I have a decent amount of armor. I've got a little fizz shifting here. Got Suppress Cap from the shield. Those are the changes. Admittedly, the evasion is lower now, but I bet we can put something in here. Bump that up a bit. I'd try to drop Defiance Banner for Arctic Armor. Because Arctic Armor is going to feel really, really good on a setup like this. Unfortunately, what that means is there's too much reservation. So you're going to need maybe a Circle of Fear, or you're going to need to run Hatred on your Blessing. Something to get rid of some reservation so that you can run all of this stuff. And, as I look at this more, maybe Determination is the wrong way to go. Maybe you just go Grace and chill with the Arctic Armor. It's given another path to improve the max Fizz hit, and especially if some Fizz taken as, it's not super tanky. But it's good enough when mapping, and I'd also want to stress Chaos Res a little more, probably use a couple less uniques, that way I can cap out my resistances more easily, but I do tend to like builds that are more towards the defensive side than a lot of players. Now coming over to Puri Ninja, here are just a few examples of characters that I looked at. We've got one that's got insane DPS, going full in on damage. This is, again, towards the squishy end of things. But Bottled Faith, Legacy of Fury, and remember, this is without things like Heat Shiver. This is without Yoke of Suffering. This is without Nightblade, without Trinity. This guy does a ton of damage. He's gone all in. But maybe he's looking at the max end of damage. What about someone who values defenses a little more? Here's a more defensive setup, a little similar to the hybrid I was going for. The Wasp Nest is just a good early weapon. There's no specific reason to use it. There's also no specific reason not to. And the Calm Spirit enables Berserk. It disables life regen, so your recovery is going to be a little more flask reliant. But you have a life on kill from Trickster, so that feels pretty good. Using Wind Dancer, meaning evasion is still relevant. Is there Fizz taken as? No Fizz taken as. Also no Heat Shiver. And I do think Heat Shiver is the way to go here. But Calm Spirit in place of Southbound is really cool, and when you have Berserk active, that's another defensive layer. So this is a way to build defenses that doesn't necessarily just rely on armor. But going back to the list, like I mentioned, you don't necessarily need the most defenses because you will be freezing enemies, and frozen enemies don't get to do damage. This is another example, and I really like the rare gloves here. Getting the additional strike will feel awesome. You don't absolutely need it, but I wouldn't give this up unless I have to. Calm Spirit, maybe worth it. Southbound early on to enable Heat Shiver, probably worth it. This or Calm Spirit is where I'd settle, depending on how it felt to play the build. If you want to know more about Frostblade Trickster, then check out Captain Lance. He did a League Start test recently, and his results were pretty positive. On the other hand, if you want more detailed guides on Frostblades and everything about it, check out Behind Eyes Gaming, who's been making guides on it for quite a few leagues. I'll link to both of those content creators down below. For now, let's start talking about the next build on my list. And this is by far the most off-meta, Hydrosphere. Yep, that's right, the meme skill that's not a meme skill. Because Hydrosphere has really interesting mechanics that make it far more effective than you'd first think. It's a base Fizz skill, and converts its damage entirely, which means you have easy access to Hatred scaling, and if you want to go Heat Shiver, well, you can. Though Trinity is going to be a little bit harder because as an orb skill, there's a lot of mechanics that don't work with it. And by a little harder, I mean no. You can't use Trinity support with an orb skill, so it doesn't work for Hydrosphere, unfortunately. So here's 10's quick and dirty introduction to Hydrosphere mechanics. Remember, the background gameplay is just to give you an idea of what the skill looks like. It is not reflective of League Start or even a finished Hydrosphere build. Just something that I threw together in Standard so that you can vaguely see what the orb looks like. Be sure to ponder it as I talk about how it works. You create a sphere which pulses. It can pulse under certain conditions, such as when you inflict an ailment on it, or when you resummon it. The sphere deals cold damage while unaffected by ailments, but if it's frozen or brittle, then it converts to cold. And if it's shocked or sapped, it converts to lightning. I think the theory behind this was that you alternate between cold and lightning and do some sort of hybrid build, but the reality is most people just go cold since Hatred is awesome. Hydrosphere also drenches enemies, a special debuff that reduces their cold and lightning resistance. But that's where things get really interesting, because when you recast Hydrosphere, like I mentioned before, it pulses, damaging all drenched enemies in a large area. That's right, all drenched enemies, not just the ones in the radius of the sphere. Which means if you aggressively reposition your Hydrosphere, scaling cast speed, you're able to spread that love and really drench the map for massive damage. I first came across this interaction through Octavian's build a few leagues back, but more recently Arrow has been playing it as well. So let's take a look at his POB and I can give my thoughts. When I first saw Hydrosphere, I thought it was only a utility skill. Or maybe it was just a niche meme, kind of like how Void Sphere is. But with a full understanding of how Drench works, it's actually pretty cool. Now, it is a little bit clunky, especially when you have low cast speed, and you definitely need to think about your positioning pretty well in comparison to other builds. But do that, and you'll absolutely be rewarded. Now, out of all the builds that I'm talking about here, this one has the most well-rounded balance of mechanics that can be used for both bossing and mapping, along with a variety of situations where some of the other builds do struggle just a little bit, such as in the early leveling experience. So here we have Arrow's POB. Just at a quick glance, I like that we've got a solid amount of damage. We've also got decent defenses. Not super tanky, but this is an early game sort of tree, and that makes sense. Also coming down here, there's some Black Chance, which is a little spicy, and honestly, I like it. It's sort of spicy that I love. Got all sorts of skills that are either disabled or enabled. Very reasonable gear with a mist wall and just some basic life and resist. There's a lot of room here to make the gear way better and get these stats up. For example, you could work in spell suppression, zero problems. Evasion ES bases, all right, a little bit harder, but if you get just a couple of good pieces with a lot of ES on them, get evasion bases everywhere else, spell suppress cap, zero issues. Oh, I guess you would have to come over here and grab Instinct like most people do up at the top of a tree. Do you need the defenses? I mean, not necessarily, but I'd probably want them, especially because this is a low armor or zero armor build. So Fizz Taken As, you can get it on your helmet, get it as an implicit, that'll feel really good. Fizz Taken As on your chest, all those defenses would be looking really well-rounded. Talking about the defenses, because I think the damage is already in a good spot. I wouldn't necessarily care about scaling the damage anymore, as long as I'm going for early league setup, which this is exactly that. Got Hydrosphere here, we're going crit. Got some interesting intensify stuff going on. Increased crit strikes if you need it, but it's not currently active, and 77% crit chance, already pretty good. Defensively, Tempest Shield, we've got some Grace going on. Can even hit Vol Grace occasionally to evade, makes it very effective when you do. Hatred for damage scaling. Herald of Ice. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the increased crit strikes on Herald of Ice. I think it's fine to just go with an additional defense, maybe a Vol or regular Arctic armor. Though if Reservation is pretty rough, you'd probably need to get an Enlighten or some tattoos. Assassin's Mark Frostbite, yep, good old Fire and Forget Arcanist brand. Vortex with Bone Chill increases the enemy cold damage taken. This wasn't as necessary in Frostblade's build because that was really cold and fire, but in a pure cold build like this, oh yeah, Vortex feels really good. Put it on your left click, never think about it. Arcane Surge for that sweet cast speed. That'll make it feel much better because cast speed is a great stat. As you can see, we've got 19% increased cast speed on the Prophecy Wand. You could even use a Profane Wand for more cast speed if you can find it. One great thing about Occultist is if you're ever really struggling on Chaos Res, you can temporarily grab this. Long term, I wouldn't. Long term, much better to have Unholy Authority for dual curse. You can also get Frigid Wake. You can't be frozen or chilled, and you freeze nearby enemies. Frozen enemies don't get to hit you. Freezing enemies is a great defensive layer, and reducing the damage that they deal is also good. That's part of why this build gets away with being as low on armor as it is. Forbidden Power gives AoE. Remember, Hydrosphere drenches in a large area, making that bigger feels nice. On the Frostblade setup, I wasn't quite sure if a cluster was worth it. On this setup, I really like it. I think we're in a good spot here. The Sublime Form tech, very nice. Fits Grace in perfectly. We've got Ghost Dance, so you get to recover Energy Shield really easily. There's a big old degen on your ES, so you definitely want to be doing that. And it also means, in theory, if you're really struggling for mana, you would lose a lot of survivability. Well, you'd lose a little survivability. You could take Eldritch Battery. I wouldn't advise this long term, but in a pinch, it's fine. Also means you don't need to run Inspiration support. Vaal Arctic Armor, Arrow's already got me. He's put Vaal Arctic Armor into the build. If you could get just a little more reservation, you could run Arctic Armor on top of all the other auras, and that would feel even better. Arrow also has Frost Shield in here, which gives you a massive extra bubble. I really like Frost Shield. It's a great way to increase your health. It is not linked to the cast when damage taken, so you're manually dropping it when you want your nice personal safety bubble. Then you stand still. You have all the extra defenses from about 4,000 Energy Shield, which POB is taking into account. Good. But one important thing to remember about this setup, Hydrosphere ticks on its own. However, you want to cast it as much as possible. So the cast rate and cast speed is quite valuable. And in that regard, personally, I would go with a little bit less crit scaling here and a little bit more speed scaling. I'd probably want something like Nimbleness, because that does give crit strike multiplier for spell damage. I'm not sure if I would drop Doomcast, but maybe. Or let's see. No, I want to keep Arcane Sanctuary. That would be good. Definitely want to keep the life. All that looks good. So Annihilation is 50 25s. This is crit multi, so we keep that. That's the cold damage stuff. That's the charge stuff. You know, I'm just going to do it by number. 11, 10. Oh, I guess that one doesn't quite count. 8.9. Oh, never mind. This is what I'd drop and move a mastery over here. Personally, I think this would feel very nice indeed, and you get an extra point to play with and put into damage elsewhere. Being able to pick up those spare points means maybe you can go like that. All of a sudden, we got a nice bump to the value, while also making the build feel better to play. I don't remember if this node was as good when Arrow originally made this build, because I believe he first made it in 320, then adapted it again in 321. And he might even be playing it in 322. We'll just have to see. This definitely wins the Ultimate Hipster Point Award, because it's just so different from everything else. And if you don't believe me on just how hipster this is, there were 13 people on day 3 who were on PoE Ninja playing it. I'm just going to look at the top list. What are they doing differently? This is a really great early game item for the build, and I'd get one if you can. Arrow's gearing was quite conservative, so I understand why he didn't use it. Next up, we've got Light of Lunaris, which adds a lot of damage and a little bit of block, but doesn't add to your defenses. So in this regard, I kind of like Arrow's setup better. Hopefully we have, no Fizz Taken As. Get Fizz Taken As on your helmet. Carcass Jack provides a lot of area of effect, and that AoE does translate into coverage and damage, but there's no defenses here. So this is a much glassier version of the build. 10,000 armor, not terrible, but I don't think we've got spell suppression, it looks like. So we're still going to be feeling a little squishy. The damage, though, quite high, especially with Inya's Epiphany and all the Void Battery charge stacking stuff. With Glancing Blows, the block is a slightly inferior quality, especially since we don't have recovery on block. Again, I really want to stress, this is not to call out or shame anyone. If you are happy playing your build, living your best life as a Hydrosphere Occultist, and you are going Glass Cannon, that is fine. I personally tend to like adding a little extra defenses. I do like the Void Battery. The Inyas. I don't think the Inyas is necessary, so I'd go with something defensive for those. Light of the Lunaris, I'd have to try it. It could actually be really good, could be better than Mistwall. Leaning towards Noah McCarcass Jack, though I would still try it. I'd definitely get some Fizz Taken As on my helmet to make up for the squishiness, and round out the build with Spell Suppression, which would be a lot easier if I could use my chest and shield for rares. But those are my thoughts on Hydrosphere Occultist. If you want to know more about how to play the build, or at least what Arrow did, then check out his video and his channel, which I'll link to down below. And last up, Rain of Arrows. If you want a bow skill, but you're not a fan of Lightning Arrow, Ice Shot, or Tornado Shot, consider Rain of Arrows. The damage might look low in PoB, but do remember that multiple arrows overlap, and it is an LE scaling bow build, so it gets all the LE scaling bow build goodness. This is a popular setup on Raider, and it's less reliant on Deadeye for additional projectiles. But Champion also works totally fine, and you can play Deadeye if you want to. And this is a great opportunity to stress that defenses work differently for various setups. On a Champion, you get Fortify, but on a Raider, you have really easy access to phasing and spell suppression. So on a Champion, you get extra damage reduction right off the bat, whereas with a Raider, you're protected against spells, and you'll need to scale your defenses against attacks, which Evasion works quite well for. If you're feeling really spicy, you can even do a Poison Pathfinder version. And on this note, the gameplay shown in the video is not reflective of what your League Start Rain of Arrows is going to look like. It's just to give you a quick idea of the skills and the overall gameplay. This is just something that I threw together on Standard and probably isn't very good. This just happens to be the Pathfinder variant because I was thinking of messing around with some poison stuff myself. If you do plan to play the build, a couple of uniques that you might want to look out for include 3-Step Assault. They're really common early on, so they shouldn't be expensive, and give both avoidance and move speed. Though this is kind of specific to the Raider version since you'll always be phasing. Taming is also something good because it gives a large chunk of damage when you inflict multiple ailments. As a Tri-LE Trinity build, you should be shocking, freezing, and igniting most things while mapping. Another item that I personally like on bow builds is Hyri's Truth. You get accuracy, which lets you get precise technique really effectively early on before you're able to scale crit. Even after you're able to scale crit, it gives crit multi, which is good. Mana reservation efficiency for precision, level 30 precision for a lot of accuracy, and you even get Culling Strike. This is the all-in-one early game amulet if you're playing bows. And if you want to go fast, grab Shadows and Dust for Rampage or Devoto's Devotion. Just remember both of these items lack defenses, and you'll want to get your Suppress elsewhere. Personally, I think Rain of Arrows gets unfairly overlooked because it's not as impressive in PoB as many of its other bow build counterparts. Because unlike a lot of other skills, it's circles within circles. You fire a big circle of arrows that rain down, each dealing damage within a smaller area. So you can deform the skill around walls to gain increased damage. One other thing to keep in mind about Rain of Arrows, because it overlaps, you can add extra projectiles. However, those extra projectiles are added towards the outside of a pattern, meaning they're less likely to work on single target. Increases to AoE scale both the outer and inner circles, meaning you cover a wider area but don't necessarily gain more damage. So here we have Fuzzy Duxie's Champion build. And before I get into starting too much, I think this is a good build, and if you're looking for a bow champion, it's a great thing to play. I really like a lot of the defensive layers, and I like the fact that it has solid damage on minimal investment. We've got a spine bow with a relatively moderate 1000 DPS. You can actually use Rod to make much better than this quite early on. No extra projectiles. Perseverance, which is a great item because it incentivizes you to stack defenses to gain damage, plus free onslaught for champion. A Raider version would of course look quite different to this, but I like this setup, and so I wanted to talk, because a lot of the other builds that I've talked about before are a little more evasion focused, a little more glass cannon-y, and reliant on freeze, whereas this one can actually tank some hits. This is a perfect example, by the way, of what I meant by PoB. If you look up here, oh, no damage. If you look down here, oh, there's all the damage. That is assuming 5 overlaps. I haven't looked into the actual overlap scaling here, So don't quote me on this, but I'm just going to trust that Fuzzy Ducksy has done the math and tested all of it, and that you get about 5 overlaps or possibly more. Also, if anyone's going to say, oh, but the fire max hit is low, in POB, the fire res just isn't capped. It would be pretty trivial to cap resistances by using slightly different gear here. I mean, this doesn't even have a second suffix, so just slap fire res on and you're totally fine. Damage could also be a lot higher if you went into things like the taming, but you'd need to get those resists or give up that life elsewhere. Just extra things to think about as you're tweaking the build and playing it for yourself. Another really good thing about Rain of Arrows is you get Vaal Rain of Arrows, which maims enemies and has increased effective maim. Maim slows enemies, and they're really, really slow. You used to be able to hard lock some boss fights by combining Chill and Vaal Rain of Arrows. You might even still be able to do that, and I wouldn't advise it because on most fights it's detrimental, i.e. it can prevent Chevron from phasing, but it's really hilarious on Phoenix. He automatically slows himself when he does his spinny attack, and if you hit him with the good old maim and chill, then he won't be going anywhere anytime soon, and you have all the time in the world to just tunnel damage into him. If you are fighting a boss on this build, I would absolutely save up a Vaal Rain of Arrows charge, drop it on the boss, and they're not going to be moving anytime fast, which gives you plenty of DPS uptime. You've also got passive clear with Mirage Archer, Trinity, so the damage is probably, oh no, it's already enabled, but on Piri Ninja, the numbers won't have Trinity accounted for, so they're going to be even better than they look. You may notice that in comparison to some of the other builds I've talked about, I'm saying I'd change this less. That's because this build is much more in my style. Doesn't mean it's better than the others, doesn't mean it's worse than the others, just means it's more like what I would be playing on my own if I had made this build rather than if someone else had. In fact, I made a very similar thing for this, except it was over on a Raider and it was Spectral Helix, but I did the Perseverance thing. I've done the Perseverance thing on a Trickster. I love just sticking Perseverance on a build because then I get to scale my damage from my defenses. Though I would only do it when you're able to actually get that Fortify to enable Onslaught. Or, I mean, if you're a Raider, you just have Onslaught. There's one small thing I'd change though. I'd put the Gravicious mod here for Fizz Taken As, rather than the little bit of extra armor, evasion, and life. I really don't think the armor, evasion, and life is that effective, and having the Gravicious mod is going to make your armor more effective at mitigating the large physical hits. I feel like I'm saying less about this build, and that's simply because I really like the setup already. The only thing I would change is this. I know on Champion, it's very effective to nuke your health down, get adrenaline, get the healing, all that. I hate the playstyle. So instead, I would use my new best friend, Tanuahi, where you have a chance to gain adrenaline when leech is removed by filling unreserved life. So I just put on Ye Olde Blood Rage, which might already be on in the build. Ooh, Mana Forged Arrows. Really like this. Having a Mana Forged Arrow setup like this gets you Frenzy, gets you, I'm not 100% sure why for Burning Arrow. I'd have to watch the video, which I didn't do because I wanted to give more of my raw thoughts. Definitely go watch Fuzzy Ducksy's video for an explanation of why Burning Arrow. Yeah, I like Mana Forged Arrows, and it adds a good chunk of extra damage. That is not an insignificant amount of DPS being added by that. And it's just triggering when you're dropping the Rain of Arrows. But I'd probably drop this, and I'd go for something like Tanuahi instead. They are armor evasion, so you're not giving up anything there. You do give up rage. That's a little unfortunate, though this build isn't super reliant on rage to begin with. You gain some attack speed, and you gain adrenaline that way. You could also go Death Rush instead of one of your rings, which does give valuable Chaos Res. But overall, I like this setup. It's a really cool off-meta bow build. I mean, bow champion? Who plays bow champion? I guess, yeah, EA Ignite, but is that really a bow build? That's an Ignite build, and if you think otherwise, you're definitely lying to yourself. And now, let's take a look at Piri Ninja. Because I just looked at a champion build, I want to highlight a Raider here. Notice they are all multi-ele, which means you can also go Artillery Ballista for your single target. I kind of like the Mana Forged Arrow setup more than Artillery Ballista, but I do think Artillery Ballista, especially early on, might have a little bit more damage if for whatever reason you're struggling on a Pinnacle boss. So, this is the highest level version. We've got a 3-step assault, a Devoto's Devotion, a little bit of armor, a lot of evasion. Yep, looks like a Raider build. Precise technique, haven't gone crit yet. I kind of feel like Perseverance would be cool here if you could balance your armor and evasion a little more. I know Perseverance is sold as the champion thing, but I really like it on other builds. Oh, that feels bad. Usually the reason you'd want to wear Blizzard Crown is for the extra flat damage. This is a bricked version that someone influenced. That feels bad. Good way to get more damage, not a good way to get more defenses. Speaking of, this is a little bit more of a defensive setup. Well, never mind. This is a lot more. 38k armor. Oh, that's... yeah. Okay. We are an Iron Reflexes Raider. I haven't done it in a while. Because it's day 3, the effects are a little minimized. But if we look at like week 1... oh, they went full MF. Alright. Maybe not. But that does highlight one other thing about Rain of Arrows. It excels in the early game. And it is going to fall off later in comparison to other things. So I think Hydrosphere can go all the way. And Frostblade's Trickster can go all the way. And don't get me wrong, you can still play Rain of Arrows. It's totally fine, even at week 1, even if you're fighting pinnacle bosses and clearing juice tier 16 content. But each build has its strengths, and each build has its weakness. And in terms of Rain of Arrows, I would say the late endgame scaling is one example of a weakness. But if you want to know more about Rain of Arrows Raider or Rain of Arrows Champion, I suggest checking out Fuzzy Duxie's videos that I'll link down in the description below. And so those are my top 3 picks for the best off-meta League starters. Because being different is part of the appeal for off-meta builds, playing something that you haven't before, I've tried to pick a wide variety of things that appeal to different playstyles. That way, if you're a melee main, you have something familiar to fall back on with Frostblades, since you're probably tired of Bone Shatter. Or you could stick with your melee comfort zone by playing a champion and get a little bit outside of it with the Rain of Arrows build. And if you play melee, Hydrosphere is probably the most different thing from everything you've done I can think of. But it's important to remember that all of this is just my opinion, and you might have a different opinion. So what are some of your favorite off-meta League starters? Be sure to link them down in the comments below. And stay tuned, as I'm going to have a couple of videos talking about my old builds and how they hold up in 3.22. Watch out for those, get subscribed, maybe leave a like while you're down there. With that said, if you want more League Start build recommendations, then do be sure to check out my top 10 League starters for the strongest meta builds. Or if you're playing hardcore, go over to Maxwell GG, where we should be releasing a news post soon talking about the top 5 starters for hardcore and some reliable guides that you can use to play them. I've also been covering the news and recent teasers, which I'll put up in the card and down in the description below. But with that said, thanks for watching, and a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. Link to that is down below, and it really does help me make videos just like this one and deal with the extended crunch time that is PoE League Start. So with that said, thanks for watching, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you again sometime soon.